Two powerful hurricanes and a series of monsoon flooding events in India and Bangladesh have displaced thousands of people over the last few weeks. And this has left many people asking questions about the relationship between climate change, disasters, and displacement. Is there a simple link between climate change and disasters and then people's displacement, or is the relationship far more complicated? And that is the question we're going to try and answer in this week's video. Climate change does have an impact on several different kinds of disasters, including the hurricanes that we've seen in the United States and the flooding that we've seen in India and Bangladesh. But the relationship isn't simple. Let's take a look at hurricanes, for example. It does seem that a warming planet makes certain kinds of hurricanes, and specifically the most powerful kinds of hurricanes, more likely. It also seems to be the case that as the planet warms, the hurricanes carry more water with them, and that means that when they do eventually make landfall, the flooding that comes after the hurricane strike tends to be worse. Now, there's often a desire to label a particular disaster as being caused by climate change, but the relationship is actually far more complicated. And the easiest way to express this in simple language is to say that climate change is going to alter the pattern of natural disasters in the future, or in fact that climate change is already altering the pattern of natural disasters. But that doesn't mean that we can single out climate change as the cause of any particular event. A useful analogy is with health issues that have multiple lifestyle factors. So it isn't really correct to say that someone's heart attack has been caused by eating bacon. But a lifetime of eating bacon combined with lots of other lifestyle factors might have made that person's heart attack more likely. What we've looked at so far is the relationship between climate change and the disaster itself, but there are lots of factors that determine whether or not someone is displaced or even killed in the aftermath of a disaster. And one of the most important factors, in fact the most important factor, is wealth. Wealth plays a huge role in what happens to people when disasters strike. In fact, it's probably the biggest factor that determines how well someone does in the aftermath of a disaster, and crucially, whether or not they are displaced. And this applies at a number of levels. So, for example, wealthy countries are able to invest in the kind of infrastructure and planning that prevents displacement when disasters strike. But wealthy individuals are also able to protect themselves to some extent from the impact of disasters. This can be by a number of different things. For example, buying insurance. It can mean that they can get themselves out of harm's way. They may be able to afford to move to different places during disasters. And crucially, they may be able to afford to live in places that are less likely to be hit by disasters in the first place. Now, wealth doesn't necessarily guarantee safety. But when we look across the world, it is usually the poorest countries that are hit worst by disasters, and within those countries, the poorest people who are more likely to be displaced in the aftermath of a major event. Even wealthy countries can plan badly for disasters, and a nation's wealth is not necessarily a guarantee of its citizens' safety in the aftermath of a disaster. To create safety for their citizens, countries have to invest their wealth in things that are going to protect their citizens when disasters strike. And this means a number of different things. It very often means investing in the infrastructure that protects a place against a disaster. So this, for example, can mean something like investing in levees and dams. Or for countries that are particularly vulnerable to drought, this can mean things like investing in irrigation systems that mean that agriculture can continue even when a drought strikes. And it's this kind of investment in infrastructure that reduces the likelihood of people being displaced in the aftermath of a disaster, whether it's a sudden disaster like the monsoon flooding that we've seen, or whether it's a slowly unfolding disaster like the impacts of drought or desertification. But one way or another, it is very often an investment in infrastructure by a country's government that prevents displacement in the aftermath of a disaster. But it would be wrong to assume that investment in infrastructure alone can protect a country or its people. Another key factor is specific planning around what happens during and after disasters. The way that a country deals with emergency response is also key, and even rich countries that have planned badly for disasters can find that many of their citizens are displaced in the aftermath of a major event. Another key issue is zoning and planning, and this is something that became very apparent after Hurricane Harvey. there are some locations which it is very difficult to protect in the event of a disaster, and whether local authorities allow people to live and work in those places plays a huge role in whether or not they are displaced from them in the aftermath of a disaster. One of the key ways in which people can be protected is by controlling the locations in which people are allowed to live and work if those locations are especially vulnerable. We've looked at differences between wealth as a key factor that determines whether people are displaced by a disaster, but other differences between people can also play a huge role as well. For example, even people living right next door to each other may find that they are impacted differently by exactly the same disaster. Older people, young people, children, people with disabilities often find it harder to move and get themselves to safety during disasters, and that means that these people are far more likely to be injured or killed by sudden disasters. It's also the case that race, religion and ethnicity play a role. Many countries deliberately underinvest in places that are home to religious and ethnic minorities. This is something that became very apparent after the strike of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, but examples of state underinvestment in places that are particularly populated by religious and ethnic minorities exist across the world. What we've seen is that climate change will play a role in the pattern of disasters in the future, but it is these key economic and social forces that will actually shape whether someone is displaced by those disasters or not.